everyone, and thanks for joining. If you are currently in the Netherlands, then you're probably want to be at the beach right now because I think it's over 30 degrees Celsius over here. So anyone who is here and not at the beach, thanks. We really appreciate it. Today we have a special EVIC talk with two presenters, Dr. Vanessa Tünsmeyer, and myself, Michelle Bruijn. We're both working within the EVIC project, and we're currently busy with planning our new research projects, which are planned to take place in 4 years, so 4-year during projects. We're busy with drafting this research proposal, with shaping and designing the project. So we're very much open to feedback, comments, remarks, and we hope to give you a rough first draft of our research ideas. They are separate research ideas, but of course they're both related to the broader EVIC team, human rights, and more specifically we're focused on property or housing. Vanessa will start, and after that I will join in. Each presentation will take about 15 minutes, and after each presentation there will be a room for questions, discussion, remarks. Like I said, we're very much open to your feedback. Vanessa, the floor is yours.
Perfect, thank you. Just give me 1 minute to share my screen. Okay, now can you give me a sign, a verbal sign, if you can see the full screen and with the presentation slide?
Yes, it works.
Perfect. So thank you everybody for taking your time out of your day and joining us today for this talk. My name is Vanessa Tünsmeyer, as Michelle already said. I'm a new assistant professor at the University of Groningen. My background is in the fields of human rights law and cultural heritage law. And I'm particularly interested in questions of indigenous peoples' rights. What do I want to talk to you today about? I want to discuss my research project on limitation clauses in provisions that protect minority and indigenous cultural rights. And I'm wondering whether these can be clarified in a way that embraces the culture of the group that seeks protection. And the way I want to do it, if we broadly classify it, is through systematization of the applicable law, through interpretation and through experimentation. And I will explain in the next 10 minutes what I mean by that. Now, what will I show you of the research proposal? I'll hopefully convince you that there is a problem. So what is the problem? Who are the protected groups? How do I plan to approach the issue? And why do this in the first place? So what are my objectives with this research proposal? Before I go into the substance, I actually had 2 or 3 disclaimers. Michelle already handy enough gave both of them for both of our talks. As she already mentioned, this is an upcoming research project. Now, why do I put this here as a distinct disclaimer? It's because obviously I haven't done the bulk of the research. So we're really in the idea phase and figuring out whether this has feet to walk on, so to speak. It's large scale, so it's supposed to span 4 years, right? So that also means that what I can present to you today is more on the surface level and contains the overall direction of the project. So in the abstract that you might have seen in the newsletter on the website, I went more into detail on one of the case studies, but I think for the purposes of the presentation, actually it makes more sense to explain to you the overall idea of the research project. And then I'll briefly go into the case study, and that's also where the link to the right to housing and the EVIC project comes in. If you foresee obstacles or have questions, that is perfect, because that is like you putting up this nice warning street token that you see on the picture, and that will prevent me from making that mistake, hopefully, during the research. So any questions and comments are welcome. If we don't have time for all of them after the presentation, happy to have email contact as well. Now, what do I want to do? So I mentioned limitation clauses and I mentioned cultural rights, but what does it actually mean? So the starting point is for this presentation, and also in a way for the project, is Article 27 ICCPR. That is the main core provision of the International Bill of Rights that protects minority cultural rights as a distinct group of rights. It reads, I'll read this out, but you can read along. In those states in which ethnic, religious, or linguistic minorities exist, persons belonging to such minorities shall not be denied the right, in community with other members of their group, to enjoy their own culture, to profess and practice their own religion, or to use their own language. Now you might think that this sounds very nice. What is the problem that I see, or why do I think that there is a problem? Now this is the core provision, right, that legally bindingly protects minority cultural rights. And there is no clawback clause. There is no specific limitation clause. The only guidance on what state interference is permissible with minority cultural rights is that they may not deny the rights. So that is obviously rather broad in terms of what state actions is permissible and what state action is not permissible. And that is especially problematic in light of the fact that in all cultural rights clauses that protect minority or indigenous peoples' rights, you also face the question, how do you decide which parts of a culture are quote unquote worthy of protection, are vital enough that they should be protected against state interference? So who decides what is vital enough? Who decides what is a permissible limitation versus a denial of a culture? So these are some of the underlying tensions in these clauses, and so in the rights provisions, and in particular in these quote-unquote limitation clauses. Who are we talking about? Many of you might be familiar with who indigenous peoples are, but just to be on the safe side, I wanted to first introduce indigenous peoples and then also later minorities, because these are two distinct groups that both are protected by Article 27 ICCPR. Now, there is no internationally set definition of indigenous peoples. The United Nations Permanent Forum of Indigenous Issues has basically said that they will work with a working definition, and that is the definition advanced by former UN Special Rapporteur Martinez Cobo. And the elements of indigenous peoples that they share in this definition are having a historical continuity with pre-invasion and pre-colonial societies that developed on their territories, that they consider themselves distinct from other sectors of society, and they form at present non-dominant sectors of society, and are determined to preserve and develop this ethnic identity, their ancestral territories, for future generations. So they want to continue as a distinct people. And now, who can I give you some examples of an indigenous group? Well, in Europe we have the Sami, in Australia the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. We have First Nations and Métis and Inuit in Canada. So there are globally many indigenous groups. So there are roughly 480 million indigenous people living in 90 different countries across the globe, and are more or less can be separated into 5,000 distinct groups. So we're really talking about a very broad group of peoples. How are their rights being limited? Can I give you an example where we talk about a distinct minority culture that is being limited by state action? One case that made it, for example, to the Canadian Supreme Court was the decision to develop a ski resort on a sacred mountain, and the use of this ski resort, or the ski resort uses wastewater to make artificial snow, which amongst other things results in the desecration of the mountain, and obviously then has an effect on the community's right to enjoy, profess their religion. So those are indigenous peoples for the purposes of today. Minorities, again, there is also no set uniform definition in international law. Different definitions exist. We have groups within a state that are non-dominant or numerically smaller, whose members are residents or nationals of a state, so there are different elements, and whose members share culture, ethnicity, religion, or a language. So these are who we talk about. Now, what specifically do I want to do? My research question is, as you can see, how we can clarify human rights provisions, which set out how state action may limit cultural rights of minorities and indigenous peoples in a way that accommodates the legal culture of the group whose right is at issue, without undermining the indivisibility of the human rights canon. And if this is possible, how can this be done? This is a very, very long question. How does it work out in practice? So what do I actually want to do? And why do I want to do this? So the how and the why go a bit together. My first objective is to systemize the different approaches to limitation clauses in the field of minority and indigenous cultural rights. So there, like I said, Article 27 is very broad, and there is disagreement on how this shall not be denied part of that provision is understood or should be understood. And there are variations of such rights in different regional treaties, as you may know. The first step is to clarify through systemization. The second step is to clarify the scope of minority and indigenous rights to their culture by combining doctrinal legal analysis, so by interpreting the law, with community-engaged participatory research. And now this is where this idea that I started with at the very beginning of finding a way to accommodate the legal or the legal culture that seeks protection under minority rights provisions into the interpretation and application of the provision. And the third objective, which is, I would say, very experimental in the sense that this might work, this might not work, is to potentially build a bridge between the legal cultures through the way in which these drawback clauses, limitation clauses, or just cultural rights provisions are applied. And the experiment here is with participatory research as a method of treaty interpretation, and to explore if this can be used to complement other quote-unquote more traditional methods of interpretation. How the project is basically divided into 4 parts. So I have a systematic analysis, already mentioned this in the beginning, and then 2 case studies, and this is here where the right to housing and the evict project comes in. So all parts, the meta look from the top down at international and regional international law is doctrinal, but the case studies then combine doctrinal research into the applicable law with community engaged research. I have 2 case studies, or will likely have 2 case studies, one on the evictions of Roma and Sinti from sites, and another case study featuring indigenous peoples. And then the 4th part at the very end will be a synthesis of this top-down approach, which is more the doctrinal interpretation approach, I would say, and then the bottom-up, which is the community-engaged research. Now, I've mentioned community-engaged research quite a lot, but what do I actually mean by this? Now, this definition comes from the field of medicine, but I think for the purposes of this presentation, I found it very direct and useful, so that's why I use it, but the method has been used in legal research as well. Now, community-engaged research is a process that incorporates the input from people who are affected by the research and involves them as partners. So that includes co-designing research questions, making decisions together, really elevating the affected participants basically as co-authors. And you can see how I want to do that in the case studies. So I picked out the case study that will feature Roma and Sinti for today. The the idea here is to look at the intersection of the right to housing and the dimension of providing culturally adequate housing with the right to culture of minority groups. And to see whether evictions are, for example, a potential violation of Article 27 ICCPR. And this connection is useful in two ways. I think from the one side, Article 27 ICCPR can probably be used to fill in, let's say, what culturally adequate actually means in terms of housing. And that's more connected to this question of limitation clauses. The other way that it works is to use evictions or the right to housing as context and use the respective limitation clauses to interpret Article 27 ICCPR. The method is collecting data on how community members perceive evictions and which state interference they experience as a denial of their right to enjoy their own culture. And the community engaged research as a method is, as you may imagine, qualitative. It's more common, arguably, I find, in indigenous legal research, which is also where I encountered it for the first time, and connected to the law and anthropology field. But I think it really has something that it can add in the interpretation of cultural rights provisions. And one example that I just wanted to give you, if you're curious how this looks like, Catherine Bell and Val Napoleon have done a fantastic work using this method in connection with cultural heritage of indigenous peoples, and there are several of these studies in the volume that I cite here on the slide. What are the open questions? And that's the last point before I leave you with a lot of questions and no answers, so apologies for that. Obviously, like the first step after having clarified all of this is finding community partners. So that is something I'm about to start. Another question, or not question, but maybe something that the research always has to position itself vis-a-vis is the universalism versus cultural relativism debate, which is one of the still continuing debates, I would say, in human rights law. And then another question that I'm also considering is how far is the analysis of the minority right to culture in isolation useful vis-a-vis looking at it in a particular context. So, for example, in the context of the right to housing. I think it is useful for a number of reasons, but I understand that this is a criticism that can be launched against my proposal as a whole. Yes, and then I would like to conclude with asking you what questions you may have. And I thank you for your attention and look forward to questions and emails.
Thank you, Vanessa. Very interesting. I already wrote down a lot of questions, but I'll first open the floor to anyone else who might have questions. This is also the moment where you can open your camera if you want to. So we try to engage in a more informal and personal setting. Anyone with a question for Vanessa? Yes, Caroline. Nice that you're here, and go ahead.
Yeah, I'm interested. I have particular interest in gypsies. So a bit, well, this depends what you call Roma and so on, but I've got a particular interest in gypsies in the UK. And my question is, where are you citing your research in that area? Because potentially I could give you lots of links into the UK, but you might not be interested in what we're doing. But I was involved in a case with an organisation where their rents, they were people who lived in caravans, and they were being forced to pay an awful lot more. And we didn't fight it around the right to housing, but I could see how you might. So anyway, that's just a thought. And if you're interested in the UK, I've got lots of links.
That's perfect. I'm very happy to hear that, because I actually you put your finger, I don't want to say on the wound, but that is why I haven't put a country yet, like no jurisdiction, because I figure, especially with community engaged participation, you need relationships with the community, and so that takes pre-established relationships, because for me, I'm in a way an outsider. So I have to find partners who are interested and partners who are willing and who would also benefit from this. So yeah, maybe we can talk later. That would be great.
Great. Anyone else with a question or a comment or a remark or maybe a warning sign? Well, then I have a question. I was wondering, your community engaged research, I don't know a lot about this, which I don't know nothing about this, but it sounds really interesting. And I was wondering, what do you hope to gain from this? What you, for example, cannot do with doctrinal legal research or case law analysis, or what does it provide extra?
I would say I think it's a really good question. Starting out from that perspective, I think it depends on how you view the benefits that legal research gives, and depending on how you see that, you see different advantages in using community engaged research. So there is always, I find, criticism in relation to minority cultural rights or cultural rights in general. There's frequently this discussion that who is actually deciding upon my rights, and by my I now mean that's coming from a member of a community. I'm not a member of a minority, so I put this in quotation marks on purpose. And this idea of, if, for example, you are in you are claiming a case in front of a judiciary. So I know some of the numbers for Canada and the United States because that's where I did research before. And there are, if you look at the percentage of the population and then the percentage of the people who are of First Nation or Métis or Inuit identity, self-identify as such, and who are members of the judiciary, the numbers are really small, really, really small. And also same goes for the members of the legal profession. And I think that has also been the trigger that stimulated a lot of this this evolution. And then there's a very clear advantage, right, to talking with minority groups and seeing how they would view their own culture and what they see as a state limitation versus a violation. So where do they draw the line between what is vital and what is more on the periphery? Because a lot of the discussion is also surrounding elements such as who are the experts who are brought into court cases, for example, who then get to narrate, let's say, to the judge what is a culture and what is not a culture. So it has different advantages. I think one of the advantages is to then level the playing field in a way. And the second advantage is to, I see a comment by Fiona Johnson. And another advantage is really this idea, hopefully, to bridge legal cultures in a way that you cannot do if you only do research within one legal culture. And here I'm, international law as a legal culture.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. That's convincing. It just seems for me so, how do you say that? So bizarre that it's 2023 and that there's so much lack of information about this and so much lack of knowledge apparently on this issue.
Yeah, I agree. And I have to be honest, I never learned it in my law study. So if I had not done my research on indigenous cultural heritage and had a research stay in Canada, I would not have, I think, encountered this kind of method at the time that I did. So it's exactly the comment that I see by Fiona Johnson, is this idea of really working with people who are affected by minority rights and move away from this idea that somebody who is not a member of the community can just write and talk about the community without their active involvement as partners. And so that is the hope of what I would like to achieve with the POST project. We'll see how it works, but I think if you don't try, you will never, get anywhere.
And are there scholars or people in general who have already tried to sort of systemize or conceptualize indigenous people's rights or cultural heritage? Has this been tried before?
I mean, it depends on what you, which aspect you focus on, right? Because there's a lot on indigenous people's rights. I mean, the whole UNDRIP, arguably the UNDRIP Declaration is basically an effort at systematization and application of cultural rights to the context of indigenous peoples. But this specific look at the limitation clause and the drawback clauses is missing, which I understand because there is such a plethora of different provisions and different approaches that it's also very confusing. So that's also where I see, even like from a doctrinal level, I see a benefit there, because it's really all, I don't want to say all over the place, but minority, like the cultural rights, Article 27, started out as being understood as just a passive obligation, to then shifting into this understanding that it actually involves positive obligations by the state. And to me, the next step is to then flesh out more concretely where the borderline is of what a state may or may not do.
Clear, thanks. Looking at the time, we have room for one more question. There. Or warning sign, or anything like that. Is there anyone who has a question or comment for Vanessa? I don't see any. Thanks, Vanessa. We'll probably continue this discussion within the EVIC project, of course, and maybe in a later stage you can present again, and then on the progress of the proposal or the progress of the research, hopefully, of course. And then it's time for me to share my screen. Let's see. I hope this works.
Yes, it does.
Great, thanks. Well, for me, it's a little bit the same story. So also a research project or research proposal for a project that is planning to take 4 years. My name is Michelle Bruijn, by the way. People who went to or watched multiple EVIC talks probably know me by now, but I am an associate professor within the EVIC project and at the University of Groningen. And my research project will be about building utopia towards a crime-free and healthy society. And if I Google utopia, one of the first pictures that Google shows me is, this. Apparently this is where you want to live right now, or in the future. It seems it looks a bit futuristic. So this is apparently what utopia looks like. But what is utopia in the sense that I'm speaking about? I'm talking more about utopia that's not necessarily futuristic, but something that national governments, but also local governments strive for, and that is creating a society that is crime-free, that is healthy, that is happy, basically what everyone wants. And of course, since the beginning of times, national and local governments are tasked with basically regulating everyday life. They make sure that rules and policies exist. They facilitate that we live together in such a small space that is only getting smaller, or people are getting bigger, but also more people. So space is decreasing, and they enforce laws, they make laws to make sure that we can live together. And like I said, ideally these living together, these societies are crime-free, people are happy, people are healthy. So governments really strive for this form of utopia. Yet by wanting to create utopia, wanting to create a crime-free and healthy society, they often reside towards a sort of social engineering techniques. For example, through immigration and border controls, but also more on a local level through zoning and planning, permit systems and housing policies or housing strategies. Yet by doing so, they often interfere with human rights, such as the freedom of movement, the prohibition on discrimination, the right to privacy, and right to housing, and the right to property, of course. And that's what I want to focus on. So the influence of state actions in establishing a healthy and crime-free society, my form of utopia, and the influence of these state actions on the right to housing and the right to property. Now, when I say the right to property, I only look at people who want to live or already live in a house. So property rights only when it comes to owner-occupiers, people who actually use their property rights to basically strengthen their right to housing or their housing rights. And I want to do this study or pursue this study both in the Netherlands and in the United States. And if you look at healthy behavior or maybe even unhealthy behavior and crime-free behavior and a relationship to housing, I want to focus on drug use because drug use could have an impact on access to housing, for example, or maybe even can lead to eviction. Tobacco consumption, so smoking cigarettes, smoking tobacco. Alcohol consumption, you see a big or growing attention towards alcohol prevention, and unsanitary living conditions. And if you look to more crime-free, so criminal activities, striving for a crime-free society, and the relation or the potential impact it could have on housing rights, I want to focus on a drug-related crime, people with a criminal background, violent or threatening behavior, and gambling and sex work. And within the EVIC project, we basically make a distinction between three types of housing rights or the three different components of the right to housing. We distinguish access rights, so people who want to access a house, in-housing rights, so for example, adequate standard of living requirements, and exit rights, so the protective rights when someone is forced to exit a house, so the classic eviction cases. And in my envisioned research project, I want to make this same distinction, so studying state actions to create a crime-free and healthy society, and the influence on either the exit rights, the in-housing rights, or the exit rights. And if we then turn back to these potential activities or behaviors that could impact these housing rights, if you look at drug use, I can envision, and we already see that, especially in the United States, that drug use is an element that could lead to denial of access to housing if someone is known for being a drug addict, for example. But it could also lead to evictions if someone is caught using drugs in an social housing residence, for example. Tobacco consumption, this is not yet an issue in the Netherlands, but we're moving towards that. But in the United States, there are already a lot of housing associations which have rules on the use of tobacco. There are not a lot of known cases where it is a hamper for accessing housing, but I can envision that that could be an issue. But there are definitely cases where people are being evicted because they're smoking tobacco, either inside their house or, for example, on shared balconies or patios or gardens. Alcohol consumption, you see similar issues. There are alcohol-free zones, and if your neighborhood is located in such an alcohol-free zone, that it could be that alcohol consumption could lead to housing issues. There hasn't been any research so far on this, so there's not a lot known about this particular issue, but I think it's really interesting to see if this is an area where housing rights could also possibly be endangered. And of course, unsanitary living conditions like mold or pest, which could of course also lead to limitations of your in-housing rights, but also to evictions. And with criminal behavior, we see a lot of drug-related crime issues, which leads to evictions if you're engaged in drug dealing or growing cannabis, for example. We see, of course, a lot of issues both in the Netherlands and the United States with people being denied housing because of their criminal background, because they have a criminal record. Violent behavior, people that are being evicted because of violent or threatening behavior inside the house, but also surrounding housing or an apartment building. Gambling, and the same with sex work. We even see it not only with illegal sex work, but in the Netherlands we have also legal sex work, and we see there that is a limitation for trying to access a housing, but it could also lead to eviction. And next to the distinction between the types of right to housing, I also want to make a distinction between the types of interferences with the right to housing or curtailments with the right to housing or the right to property in owner-occupier cases. I want to make a distinction between congruent and incongruent curtailments or interferences of the right to housing. And congruent curtailments are actions that took place in the house and that affect or could affect the housing rights. So, for example, someone who's being evicted because they were dealing drugs inside their own house. That's a congruent consequence or a congruent interference with right to housing. There's a direct link between someone's behavior or action and the consequence, which is in my example, eviction. There are also incongruent consequences or incongruent curtailments with the right to housing. For example, if it's not inside a house, but for example, drug dealing on a street or smoking tobacco in the shared garden, then the link between the behavior or the action is looser than when the link between the action and the consequence, which for example is eviction or denial of access to housing, which is looser, or in some cases could even be completely disconnected. For example, someone who has a criminal background because of shoplifting or because of shoplifting, for example, and he's denied housing because of his criminal background or because of his criminal record. Then there basically is no link at all between the criminal behavior or the conviction and the impact on the right to housing. And to make it more visible, what are exactly these congruent and incongruent consequences, I modified a framework that I previously used in a research project on smoke-free policies, so tobacco smoke-free policies. And in that research project, we made a distinction between type of spaces, indoor and outdoor spaces, and public and semi-private and private spaces. Just to show you how this congruent and incongruent consequences could work. And of course, we already know a lot of examples, for example, in semi-private areas like multi-unit housing. If you smoke tobacco inside the staircase, or more outdoor semi-private spaces like shared gardens or patios, you could be evicted in the United States because you smoke in the shared garden. So of course there is a link between the behavior, smoking in the shared garden, and the eviction, your curtailment of your right to housing, but it is more loose than when you're being evicted for an action that has actually happened inside the house. But like I already said, we also see that, for example, with criminal backgrounds, then there's basically no connection at all. Something that happened in a public outdoor space, but it has effect on your housing rights. And I want to use this framework to basically map the incongruent consequences of the right to housing, because I think that there are severe issues with the justification for these interferences with the right to housing if the link between the activity and the consequence is incongruent. Another distinction that I would like to make within this research project is the difference between direct and collateral consequences or collateral curtailments. You probably know or probably familiar with collateral consequences or collateral damage. In this case, it's just more specifically focused on the infringement or interferences with the right to housing or the right to property in owner-occupier cases. So we have direct curtailments. These are legal regulatory consequences for the right to housing that directly follow from an individual's behavior, such as the forced eviction resulting from drug dealing in the house. And it's a direct consequence, a direct link between the eviction and the dealing in of drug-related, the eviction and the drug dealing in the house. With collateral consequences or collateral curtailments, the link is farther. It's not necessarily the same as incongruent and congruent, because it could be, of course, that someone is being convicted, for example, from violence inside the house, and that a conviction in a later stage leads to denial from access to housing. Then it's a congruent consequence because there was a housing-related conviction, but it's a collateral consequence because the conviction, someone, for example, already served jail time, but years later, it still has an effect on your housing rights. So, and the collateral consequences are often invisible and also often require perspective that exceeds the traditional boundaries of legal areas, because criminal conviction could have significant impact on someone's housing opportunities. So what are these collateral consequences? And are these collateral consequences taken into account in the decision-making process? Or are the collateral consequences included in judicial review? These collateral consequences are often invisible, and I think it's important to shine more light and map these possible collateral consequences. And I would use these two frameworks or dichotomies between congruent and incongruent and direct consequences and collateral consequences to basically answer the question to what extent the state impacts the right to housing and the right to property in establishing this utopia, so the crime-free and healthy society. And I basically hypothesize that this is the area where the incongruent consequences and the collateral consequences, where the protection of the right to housing and the right to property is potentially the most vulnerable, because these consequences are most severe, they are more enduring, and it also establishes a sort of cycle where individuals struggle to achieve instability or sort of achieve stability, and it makes it difficult to break free from crime and improve their overall health. So aren't the current state responses towards establishing this crime-free society and healthy society, aren't they even achieving actually a crime-free and healthy society, or are they achieving exactly the opposite? So it's a sort of a reciprocal but also a conflicting relationship between housing rights and this goal of creating a crime-free and healthy society. To be crime-free and to be healthy as an individual person, one needs housing. Yet, to create a healthy and crime-free society, local governments are increasingly targeting housing and property rights. So this is a weird conflicting relationship. And of course, another aspect, which I haven't even talked about, but also maybe the elephant in the room, is of course that striving for a crime-free and a healthy society is a very logical goal to pursue. Like, who doesn't want to have a crime-free and healthy society? So it's a very logical and a very important goal that local governments pursue, even or often it's even obliged by international law. We see growing crime rates, we see also changing crime rates, wherefore it's important to establish this health-free society, or crime-free society. Especially in the Netherlands, we see growing violence, we see more drug-related crime, crimes become more visible. Looking at the health pillar of this research, we see a growing demand for care. Healthcare costs are increasing, and a lot of countries focus on reducing drug use, installed national plans to focus on tobacco prevention and alcohol prevention to reduce these increased healthcare costs. And countries are even also required by international law to take such actions, for example, to reduce crime, but also to reduce the number of tobacco consumers. There's this International Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, and by this Framework Convention, countries are required to actually focus on reducing tobacco. And what's also interesting is that in a lot of instances, the state acts to protect the human rights of others. So there's often a clash between the right of others, for example, of safety and security in the neighborhood. They want to live crime-free. They are bothered by drug dealers. So the state acts to protect their rights, the rights of others of safety and security, or in case, for example, of someone who's smoking tobacco on a shared balcony, they try to protect the right to health of the neighbor, but by intervening, they're interfering with the right to housing or the right to property of the person that is engaged in drug-related crime or that is smoking the cigarette. So there's also a clash between human rights there. So states are not only confronted with their international responsibility, but also trying to deal and deal with clashing human rights. And if I try to translate this conflicting relationship or this reciprocal relationship towards a research project and towards research questions, which is a very long introduction before I get to the research question. And there's basically two research questions that are central to this project. The first one is, what is the impact of state actions aimed at establishing a crime-free and healthy society on the protection of the right to housing and the right to property? And the second one goes the other way around. So this is this reciprocal relationship. To what extent do the right to housing and the right to property constrain state actions in their efforts to establish a crime-free and healthy society? A goal, like I said, that is obliged to pursue by international law. It is, of course, also a very important goal to have a working society. Like I said, I want to focus on the Netherlands and the United States, and I split this project up into 4 years. In the first 2 years, I will focus on identifying the different governmental strategies that governments use to try to create a crime-free and healthy society. And I want to identify and analyze the relationship between these governmental strategies and the potential impact these strategies or actions could have on the right to housing and the right to property, and then make this distinction between the congruent and incongruent consequences and the direct and collateral consequences. And the methods that I want to use for this are doctrinal legal research, but also interviews with local governments and housing associations, and a quantitative case law analysis to get a better overview of these different governmental strategies, and if it's already identified that there might be links, congruent or incongruent links between, for example, convictions and later access to housing. In the third year, I want to focus on the specific role that the right to housing and the right to property have in these case laws. So I want to do both qualitative and quantitative case law analysis on this. And I want to look at how courts balance these human rights clashes in case law. So if there are indeed cases where, for example, the right to health clashes with the right to housing, or the right to safety and security of the neighbor clashes with the right to housing of the person that is being evicted, or the person that's being denied access to housing. And the ultimate goal is to achieve a well-balanced approach in which the state could address societal challenges related to health and crime without undermining housing rights. I don't know if here are people from the United States, but there are definitely people from the EVIC project that were present at the Puerto Rico conference from the LSA, and we were at a presentation where they showed the US National Inventory collateral consequences of conviction, which is very interesting because that's basically a huge inventory where they show what the possible collateral consequences are of certain types of eviction. And they also show a lot of housing and property collateral consequences. Even collateral consequences, for example, of traffic violations could have collateral consequences for access to housing. Very interesting, such a database doesn't exist in the Netherlands. So what I want to do, or what I envision, is a similar type of inventory, but then only focus on the right to housing and the right to property for owner-occupiers. And then not so much an inventory, but more an index or an alert system, a sort of early warning system, to achieve that balance, so that if a government or a housing authority thinks about denying someone from access housing or eviction for a certain reason, they could go to this inventory, or they could go to this system and see if this potentially hampers the right to housing. I came up with RIA, the right to housing interference alert, which is the ultimate goal of this project. I hope this was somewhat clear, but if not, I am absolutely open to any questions, concerns, or remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michelle. I offered to look basically into the digital room and see if any of you have questions, so that Michelle doesn't have to play moderator plus presenter at the same time. A bit tricky. Are there any questions in the audience? I see Rose switching on the camera.
Yes. Hi, can you hear me or not?
Yes,
Yeah?
perfect.
Well, first of all, it sounds very interesting, Michelle. Very, very interesting. I never really thought about this, but no. Well, and also, I was rather well, shocked maybe that in the US you can actually be evicted if you smoke. In the yeah. I must say though, when you started your presentation, I kind of had a broader interpretation of health. So I was thinking, is this really how you limit it? Or because if I think about health and housing in the Netherlands, I also think about elderly people who have to get out of their house or not to get the right care, or the housing first discussion you have now, so that we should help people with say I can't really say it, but with mental problems, that they first actually need to have a house, and that we have more care that comes to them than that they. But is that also part of your health definition, or because then it will be rather broad? So I can imagine that you do not want to look into that, but maybe for the Netherlands that would actually be interesting. What's your thought on that?
Thank you. Yeah, no, that's very interesting. So I'm still thinking about whether or not I should limit my definition of health, or not necessarily my definition, but my focus on health, if I should limit it at all. So I haven't thought about the elderly problem at all, so thanks for that. I'll definitely write this down. And disability, people with disability, of course, also a very big issue in the Netherlands, and probably in the US as well. Housing that doesn't fit their needs, which is very interesting, so I'll definitely look into that. I was also thinking, for example, about people that are maybe indirectly denied housing because they follow therapy or because they use medication. So I'm still debating how broad I should take this health perspective. Also, one of the limitations I did was focusing on state action, so not looking at what landlords and housing associations do. However, what we see in the Netherlands and the United States is that they use this form of third-party policing. So they coerce landlords to enforce or to implement certain articles or provisions in housing contracts, rental leases, So so basically indirectly hamper with the right to housing. So therefore I could still look at these landlord and housing associations interferences. So thanks, very interesting, and I will definitely look into more dimensions of health, basically.
Okay, I see another camera switching on. That's great.
Can I go ahead? I'm sorry, I don't know how to put my hand up on this one. My name's Tennille. That was a great talk, Michelle. Thank you. And Vanessa, I'm in Canada. And so I work in land and property and Aboriginal law and property rights as well. Michelle, I wanted to say, I think it was really interesting talking the way you were talking about this link between criminality and housing rights. And I wonder if there's insights that can be learned from the way in which the state thinks about criminality and housing rights for people that live in encampments or in tent cities. That's what we have in Canada at the moment, and a lot of places, and they're increasing, and there's a lot of work going into it, and into that area. And I know that that's not the case study that you're talking about. I think you're talking about housing in the Netherlands. So it's not the case study in many ways, and it's the inverse, but it is an interesting thing to think through, the criminalization of persons who have shelters, right? And how the state thinks about shelters. And they're very careful in the legal decisions we have, very careful not to call them housing rights. But I just thought that might be something that's fruitful for this research. Great, thank you.
Yeah, definitely. So you're basically saying broadening my view on what housing basically is. Yeah, that's very interesting. That's definitely something that I should need to take into account, that housing is more than like 4 brick walls, or in the US wooden walls sometimes. Yeah, that's a very good suggestion. Thank you.
Okay, I think we have 1 minute to 4, so I would say I leave my question to when I see you in person, so that we can ask allow everybody to leave the room on time. But that being said, is there any last urgent question? Otherwise, you know how to contact us. I hope. We are, I think I can speak for both of us, very excited to hear input and hear your thoughts and ideas. Will only make us, make the research better.
Definitely. Oh, thank you so much. I'll definitely write your email address down. Thanks so much. Then rest me to thanks everyone for showing up and for your input. Very useful. And hopefully we can, in a few months, for example, do this again, but then with, a continued version or further version of our research proposal. Thank you so much, and enjoy the nice weather if you are somewhere here in the Netherlands.